Okay, we're back to Mr. Tucket, and here we are at chapter 16. Bridger and his partner pulled out early in the following morning. Before they were even out of sight, Mr. Grimes said, "Back to work. We lost a good part of a day, Mr. Tucket, and we couldn't afford it." He walked out of camp to get more bait sticks, and Francis went back to work on the drying hoops. Actually, they were fairly simple to make. He took a slim piece of springy willow or aspen, 8 feet long, and bent it into a circle about 3 feet across. Then he lashed the ends together with wet green rawhide that seemed to shrink when it dried, and made the two ends of the willow become one piece. After a beaver was skinned, the hide was put in this hoop, and with lacing around the sides, pulled toward the edges so that when it was dry, it would be a hard plate of hide with fur on one side. Mr. Grimes wanted 200 of these hoops. Francis ran out of rawhide that evening on the 50th hoop. He told Mr. Grimes about it. "Well, Mr. Tucket, the woods are full of deer, and you've got a rifle. Seems like a fairly simple problem to me." So the next morning, Francis walked quietly through the pine glades, glad of a chance to get away from the lean-to. Not 300 yards from the house, he stopped on the edge of a small clearing just to enjoy the morning and found himself facing a nice 3-point buck. That's a young buck. 3 points means it has only been alive long enough to have 3 little points on its horn. There was the deer, and there was Francis, with perhaps 50 feet between them. He raised his rifle, aimed at the buck's shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The little Lancaster cracked sharply, higher and faster sounding than Mr. Grimes' big bull gun, and the deer took 2 steps forward, sagging as he walked, and fell. Francis reloaded, as cool as though he were shooting buffalo chips, and aimed at the deer's head. He fired again, and it was over. He started forward, then remembering what he had been taught, stopped and reloaded again, and he suddenly started shaking all over as though he had a chill. He couldn't even walk right and had to sit down. It was silly, but he was nervous about the deer, nervous and rattled. He didn't know what it was. He just had to sit down for a minute. When he got up, it was as though it had never happened. He grabbed the deer by its rack and dragged it back to camp. Then he skinned it. There he skinned it and cut the wet hide into strips half an inch wide. By late afternoon, he was again making hoops, the incident all but forgotten. Mr. Grimes came in at about 4 o'clock, his arm full of sticks, and Francis told him about the deer. "Buck fever, Mr. Tucket, or as some call it, gun jaw. Most people get it the first time they think about shooting anything bigger than a rabbit. Usually it only hits a man once or twice, and then only if he's had time to think about it. You're lucky." "Why?" Because some get it before they shoot. They can't even pull the trigger. I watched one man, and this is pure gospel, stand up against a bear that didn't like him at all, and all he did was aim his rifle and say, "Bang!" "You mean he didn't shoot?" "Nope. Didn't even draw his hammer. If I hadn't been there to kill the bear, that man would have been nothing in a second or two, unless the bear could understand English. Ha!" But Francis couldn't laugh at the joke. He remembered shaking all over, and he hoped that when the time came, if it came, for him to face something dangerous, he wouldn't do something dumb, like say, "Bang." By the end of the week, the hoops were finished, and Mr. Grimes had gathered all the bait sticks. Next came the traps. There were 50 of them, big, double-springed traps with bait pan trips. They all had to be smoked over a low fire of green aspen to take away the smell of man. So Francis was put in charge of the smoking fire, working 10 traps at a time. They were hung over the fire with a long pole and taken off with a forked stick. Once smoked, they could not be touched by human hands. After the traps were smoked, they were hung 3 to a stick so that Mr. Grimes could carry them to the individual ponds without touching them. About halfway through the second week of working, as if on demand, cold settled in and held for a few hours. The next morning, Mr. Grimes reported that they'd start trapping that day. "There'll be ice on the ponds," he said. "That makes it easier. The beavers sort of give themselves away by cutting holes in the ice. All you have to do is drop a trap in the hole and wait. They come right into it, even if the ice melts off, and it probably will before the day's out. They will use the same place, some sort of like you'd use a hallway in a house." While he talked, he was working, lashing bait sticks and trap sticks to a long aspen pole. This pole, with 21 traps, he handed to Francis. Then he made another one just like the first. They rowed out toward the first pond well before noon. Francis was almost excited. All this labor, and now he could actually see what they'd been working toward. And he thought just maybe the back-breaking labor would slack off a bit. They dismounted at the first pond, and sure enough, despite the fact that it was turning out to be a fairly warm day, the pond was covered by a thin layer of ice. At one point, near the dam of sticks and mud along the bank, there was a broken, jagged hole about 2 feet across. In this hole, the mountain man placed one trap set on a pole that angled down into the water and stuck in the mud on the bottom. The trap was well underwater, and above the trap he tied several bait sticks to the pole with rawhide. But won't the beaver see the trap? Francis asked. He'll see it all right, came this answer, gruff and short. But he won't take notice, Mr. Tucket. At least not till he steps in the trap. Old Daddy Beaver goes more by his nose than his eyes, and if you smoked these traps right, he'll think that piece of iron is another hunk of wood. So it went, pond by pond. It was nearly dark when they finished the 14th pond. Francis had nothing but Francis had done nothing but hand out traps and bait sticks, and yet he was exhausted and more than ready to head back home for the house and a warm fire. Mr. Grimes headed back to the first pond. You're good enough to let us trap him, Mr. Tucket, he said. The least we can do is keep up. You mean there'll be one trapped already? Francis asked. More than one, I miss my guess. And of course he was right. The first pond yielded one, same with the second, nothing in the third, one in the fourth, and so on. By midnight or so, with Francis all but falling off his mare, they had 11 prime beaver. Mr. Grimes had reset all the traps, and although he didn't say anything, Francis was living in a quiet horror that they might start all over again and just keep going until they had 200 beaver. But the trapper headed his sorrel back to camp. Once there, after the fire was going and coffee started, he went to work skinning the beaver. And Francis, who could think of nothing but crawling into his big buffalo robe and forgetting everything, was told to stay up and stretch the hides on the hoops. By 8 in the morning, with no sleep, they had finished the 26 beaver they had trapped. We'll sleep till noon, Mr. Tucket, the mountain man announced. Then we start over, and we've got more work now because after this haul, we'll have to move the traps. Francis didn't hear the last word about more work. He was asleep. At noon, he didn't want to get up. He wouldn't have wanted to rise with 15 hours of sleep. But with just 4, he almost couldn't get up. Mr. Grimes dumped cold water in his face, and he did get up, spluttering, and after a little fresh venison, they started again. Francis lost all track of time. It didn't seem possible to him that human beings could live and work on such an insane schedule. Work at midnight, go to bed at dawn, get up in 4 hours, or work some more, ride out with traps and bait sticks, come back with dead, wet beaver, skin and stretch, sleep, eat while you worked, while you rode, set traps, close your eyes for what seemed like a second, then open them and work again. Finally, Mr. Grimes stopped. 5 days could have passed, or maybe 5 years, Francis didn't know. All he knew was that 200 beaver pelts were hanging and drying inside the house. It was impossible not to know that, for their stench was overpowering. We sleep now, Mr. Tucket, as long as we want, the trapper said, grinning. Francis was standing in front of him, almost falling down. The pelts have to dry for a week at least. I'll wake you at the end of the week. Oh, no, you won't, Francis thought, grabbing his buffalo robe and heading upwind of the building. Not in a week. I won't even be started catching up in a week. Wake me in January sometime, or maybe next spring. Better yet, don't ever wake me. Poor Francis. That's a hard life, buddy, let me tell you. Okay, that's it for tonight. That was chapter 16. Bye.